Everything started when the name Cuba Gooding Jr. suddenly appeared in conversations no one expected him to be part of. For years, he was known for his success, his awards, and his presence in Hollywood. But now his name was being mentioned alongside one of the most disturbing scandals involving Jeffrey Epstein. At first, it didn't seem real. People online thought it might just be another rumor, another name being thrown around without evidence. But then, something changed. Legal documents began to surface, and reports started connecting dots that many hadn't noticed before. The situation escalated when a former producer linked to Sean Combs made serious claims, mentioning an incident that allegedly took place on a yacht near the U.S. Virgin Islands. That location alone raised immediate concern because it's the same region tied to Epstein's known operations. Suddenly, this wasn't just about speculation anymore. It started to feel like a pattern. And patterns are what make stories like this impossible to ignore. What made things even more intense was how quickly the narrative began to shift. Instead of focusing on a single accusation, people began asking a much bigger question. How many individuals were actually connected to this network, directly or indirectly? The idea that someone from mainstream Hollywood could be mentioned in the same breath as one of the most controversial figures in recent history made the story explode across the internet. But here's where things get even more complicated. Not everything being said has been proven, and that's exactly what keeps this story in a strange gray area. On one side, there are official filings and documented claims. On the other, there's a flood of speculation, theories, and interpretations spreading faster than anyone can keep up with. And in a case like this, separating fact from assumption becomes almost impossible. Still, one thing is clear. The moment these names started appearing together, the entire narrative changed. What once seemed like a closed chapter in history suddenly reopened, pulling new attention, new questions, and a wave of curiosity that hasn't slowed down since. And just when it seemed like this was the peak of the story, even more details began to surface. Details that would shift the focus away from individuals and toward a place that many believe holds some of the darkest secrets of all. As the focus shifted away from individuals and toward locations, attention quickly locked onto Little St. James, a place that had already built a reputation surrounded by secrecy and unanswered questions. What once seemed like just a private island owned by Jeffrey Epstein began to take on a much darker image as more accounts started to surface. At first, it was just scattered reports, but over time, a pattern began to form that was difficult to ignore. Multiple statements described how people were transported to the island using private planes, boats, and even helicopters. The journeys themselves appeared controlled and carefully arranged, but what raised concern was what allegedly happened after arrival. According to some accounts, individuals found themselves in situations where their ability to leave was suddenly restricted. Personal belongings were reportedly taken, and the isolated nature of the island made it nearly impossible to seek help or escape on their own. What made this even more unsettling was the suggestion that certain individuals involved in transportation or logistics may have been aware of these movements. While nothing has been definitively confirmed in many of these claims, the idea that multiple layers of people could have witnessed something unusual without intervention added to the overall mystery. It created a sense that whatever was happening there wasn't random. It was structured. Then there was the island itself. Satellite images and public reports hinted at a layout that wasn't just designed for luxury, but possibly for control. Its remote position, limited access points, and self-contained environment made it one of the most difficult places to fully investigate. Every detail added another piece to the puzzle, but never the full picture. And just when it seemed like the island's isolation was the most disturbing part, attention began to turn inward, toward what was allegedly hidden inside its buildings. Because what people claimed to have discovered next would raise even more questions than the island itself ever did. Among the many details that surfaced about the island, one stood out more than anything else. A fully equipped dental facility located in a place where most people wouldn't expect it. Reports suggested that Jeffrey Epstein had access to this setup, and attention quickly turned to those in his inner circle, including Ghislaine Maxwell. What made this discovery unusual wasn't just the presence of the equipment, but the questions surrounding why it existed in such a remote and isolated location. At first, some dismissed it as a luxury convenience, something a wealthy individual might install for personal use. But as more discussions began online, speculation started to grow. People questioned whether there was a deeper purpose behind it, especially considering the broader allegations already tied to the island. Survivor accounts, though not always verified, added to the concern by describing experiences that didn't align with normal medical practices. The idea that such a facility could be used for something beyond basic healthcare quickly became one of the most talked about elements of the entire case. Even without confirmed evidence, the mere possibility was enough to keep people paying attention. It wasn't just about what was proven, it was about what seemed possible given everything else that had already been revealed. What made this detail even more unsettling was how it connected to a larger pattern of unanswered questions. Why was there such a high level of privacy? Why were so many aspects of the island's operations unclear? And why did every new detail seem to raise more concerns instead of providing clarity? As investigators and journalists continued digging, they began to shift their focus again, this time away from physical locations and toward communication. Because buried within thousands of documents and messages, there were patterns that didn't seem to make sense at first, but once noticed, became impossible to ignore. When large batches of documents and emails began to surface, investigators noticed something strange: repeated references to ordinary items that didn't seem to fit the context of the conversations. Messages linked to Jeffrey Epstein included mentions of food like pizza, sushi, and other everyday terms, but the way they were used raised questions. These weren't casual conversations about meals. The wording, timing, and context often felt out of place, leading some to believe there might be more behind them. At first, these references seemed insignificant, but as more emails were reviewed, patterns started to emerge. The same types of words appeared across different conversations, sometimes in situations where they didn't logically belong. This led to speculation that these terms could be coded language, phrases meant to disguise something else entirely. While no official confirmation has fully validated these interpretations, the consistency of these patterns made them difficult to dismiss outright. What made this even more intriguing was how these discussions connected to earlier controversies involving leaked communications from high-profile figures. The idea that certain groups might use coded language wasn't new, but seeing similar patterns appear in different contexts reignited public curiosity. Suddenly, people weren't just reading emails, they were trying to decode them. This shift turned the investigation into something much larger than expected. It wasn't just about actions anymore, it was about communication, intent, and hidden meaning. And with every new document that surfaced, the mystery only deepened. But just when it seemed like the focus would remain on these coded messages, the narrative took another unexpected turn, one that introduced even more disturbing theories and pushed the story into territory that many weren't prepared to confront. As more of these unusual communications were examined, attention began shifting toward repeated references that seemed even more out of place. Words like jerky, recipes, and storage details kept appearing in messages linked to Jeffrey Epstein and individuals within his network. On the surface, these conversations looked harmless, almost mundane. But when placed next to everything else that had already been uncovered, they started to feel off. The level of detail in some of these exchanges, discussing quantities, preparation methods, and transportation, felt unusually specific for something so ordinary. This is where speculation began to intensify. Some observers suggested these could be coded references, similar to the pattern seen in earlier emails involving food-related terms. Others argued that jumping to conclusions without solid proof could be misleading. And that's exactly what made this part of the story so complicated. It sat right on the edge between possibility and assumption, pulling people deeper into the mystery without giving them a clear answer. What added to the confusion was how frequently these references appeared. It wasn't just one or two isolated messages, it was a pattern repeated across different conversations and time periods. That consistency made it difficult for many to dismiss entirely, even if there was no definitive explanation behind it. At the same time, investigators and journalists continued to stress the importance of separating verified evidence from interpretation. Still, the damage to public perception had already been done. Once people started connecting these dots, the narrative expanded rapidly. It wasn't just about locations or individuals anymore. It became about the possibility of hidden systems, coded exchanges, and layers of secrecy operating beneath the surface. And just when it seemed like the story had reached its most complex point, another angle began to emerge. One that connected influence, media, and a completely different kind of controversy that few expected to be part of this narrative. As the story continued to unfold, attention unexpectedly shifted toward the world of entertainment and media, where past moments began resurfacing under a new light. Clips featuring figures like Ellen DeGeneres and Steve Harvey started circulating again, drawing attention for reasons that hadn't been widely questioned before. At the time they originally aired, these moments were seen as lighthearted or even humorous. But now, in the context of everything else being discussed, some viewers began interpreting them differently. Certain conversations about skincare treatments and anti-aging methods, which once seemed harmless, suddenly became part of a larger discussion online. People began asking whether there was more behind these topics than what was presented on the surface. While there's no confirmed evidence linking these segments to any wrongdoing, their reappearance added fuel to an already growing fire of speculation. This shift highlights something important about how narratives evolve. Information that once seemed irrelevant can take on entirely new meaning when placed next to other claims, even if those connections aren't fully proven. And in cases like this, where emotions and curiosity are already high, it doesn't take much for a simple clip to become part of a much bigger theory. What made this even more impactful was the involvement of well-known public figures. When recognizable names enter a conversation like this, it amplifies attention instantly. It draws in more viewers, more opinions, and more interpretations, creating a cycle that's hard to slow down. But despite all the noise, one key issue remained unresolved: the physical evidence. And that's when focus began shifting once again, this time toward a location that many believe could hold answers that go far beyond speculation. The narrative then moved toward Zorro Ranch, a massive and relatively isolated property in New Mexico that had long been associated with Jeffrey Epstein. Compared to the island, this location received far less public attention at first. But as new reports began to surface, it quickly became clear that it might play a significant role in understanding the bigger picture. Investigators reportedly began looking into claims connected to the ranch, including allegations that suggested hidden activities may have taken place there. Some reports mentioned emails referencing the location in ways that raised concern, while others pointed to statements from individuals who claimed to have knowledge of events tied to the property. While many of these claims remain under investigation or unverified, they added another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming case. What made the ranch particularly difficult to analyze was its size and isolation. Covering thousands of acres, it presented a challenge for any thorough investigation. The scale alone meant that even if something had occurred there, uncovering clear evidence would not be simple. This uncertainty left room for both legitimate inquiry and unchecked speculation, further blurring the line between fact and theory. At the same time, discussions around the ranch began to highlight a recurring issue in the broader story: lack of clarity. For every new detail that emerged, there seemed to be just as many unanswered questions. And with so many gaps in confirmed information, people were left trying to piece together a narrative that still felt incomplete. But even as attention remained fixed on this location, one final detail began to surface. One that raised serious questions about what may have happened behind the scenes just before everything started to unravel. As the timeline approached the period just before Jeffrey Epstein was taken into custody, reports began to focus on a series of unusual purchases that quickly caught public attention. Among them were large quantities of industrial materials, including chemicals that sparked widespread debate about their intended use. On paper, there are legitimate reasons for acquiring such substances, especially for maintenance or specialized equipment. But the timing and the scale made many people question whether there was more to the story. Some observers argued that these purchases could be explained through routine operations tied to the properties. Others pointed out that the quantities seemed excessive compared to typical usage, leading to speculation about alternative purposes. This divide in interpretation once again highlighted the central challenge of the entire case: figuring out what is fact, what is assumption, and where the truth actually lies. What made this moment particularly significant was how it fit into the broader timeline. Occurring just before major legal actions were taken, it raised questions about whether there was any connection between these purchases and the events that followed. While no definitive conclusions have been reached, the coincidence was enough to keep people asking questions. In the end, this entire story remains a complex mix of confirmed information, ongoing investigations, and widespread speculation. Each new detail adds another piece to the puzzle, but never the full picture. And that's what continues to draw attention, because as much as has already been revealed, it still feels like there's something missing. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of all: the idea that the full truth might still be out there, waiting to be uncovered.